Alright, so these two might be a little more difficult to compare as far as doing this whole remake versus thing, compared to the other stuff that we've done so far, because, interestingly enough, I think well, the other movies we've talked about have been, like, pretty different, from original to remake. I think this will probably be, the closest that we talk about as far as the remake being pretty much a copy of the original movie, with just the names being changed and like maybe a scene here or there or a moment here or there, but for the most part, it's the same scenes, most of the same dialogue, and all that. So like when I watched them back, I had forgotten how closely the remake remained to the original. But there are some changes here and there that we can talk about. So, and just even talking about the sort of more modern nature of the 1998 movie, obviously, not even though it's 1998, it still feels quite modern in at least a couple of senses. Like when they show up at the camp at the beginning, where, in the 61 movie, you're going to see kids from 1961 just, running around doing whatever. And, of course, one of the first things we hear from one of the kids in the 98 movie is, "My phone doesn't work out here. How will we ever survive?" And it's like, wow, in 1998 they were already calling that. Okay. And it's like, and I think then it was still just to make calls. So that, and, the idea of Dennis Quaid being interested in marrying women in their 20s has not changed since 1998, it seems. So, yeah, it's, despite this very sort of modern telling, whether it be today or 1998, it's interesting how closely it stays with a movie from 1961, yet still manages to feel fresh, despite also kind of being the whole... Well, it's not necessarily like, a body-switching movie necessarily. It's definitely got the same vibe, and like sort of a very similar setup, obviously. Where it almost gives you like a Freaky Friday kind of vibe without actually physically switching. From... Yeah, I mean, they're switching, but you get it. As far as the lead performance or performances, what's really interesting about these movies is I'm pretty sure, because obviously nobody knew who Lindsay Lohan was in 1998 because this was her first movie. I feel like I and many other people were under the assumption that unless you looked at the credits, that these were two different girls. And I feel like you could... I mean, obviously I wasn't around in 1961, but I would not be surprised if the same thing was thought of for Hayley Mills, except for the fact that Lindsay Lohan could get away with it a little more because it was her first movie, whereas Hayley Mills had already had Pollyanna just before this, and I think one other movie before that. And of course, Pollyanna, she was... I really love that movie also, then she's, like, award-worthy in it. So she was kind of coming into this, but what I do think is especially interesting about what Lohan does, as far as this being her first movie, is what exactly it takes to play two different parts that feel like two different people. Because that's something where, like, if any actor does it, it's usually something I'm kind of a sucker for, and I'll, like... It's more often than not, it's usually kind of amazing to see what an actor can do with a part like this. And be able to portray two different characters that feel like... Where, like, just looking at them, even though they look exactly the same, you can tell which character is which just by, like, the way they speak or a mannerism or something like that. And for an actress who was as young as she was at the time, and on her first movie, it's especially impressive. I do think what Hayley Mills does, there is a bit more of a separation of sorts, I guess you could say, like between the two characters, where you kind of get what's really interesting is how you get the sense that Susie, and it's gonna be... I'm gonna be scrambling to remember names here since they switched them up, but I believe it's Susie and Sharon in this one, and then Hallie and Annie in this one. I'm pretty sure. So Susie, I believe, is the one in the original movie that's the one that's kind of more versed in deceit, I guess you could say. And so you have characters like Sharon who are just kind of like it seems like they've probably rarely ever gotten in trouble in their life, and now they've got to be put in this situation to become this character. And of course, Sharon's the type where she's not used to lying or going sort of off the path of this good kid nature. So she almost like immediately blows her cover with the whole sort of nails thing, and getting almost overexcited about the changes and the fact that they're pulling this off because there's such kind of an innocence about her. And she does stumble more here and there. There is the moment that I really love when it's like the facade is almost coming down and she's just about to get caught, and one of the giveaways is that she seems to suddenly know piano now, something that clearly Susie wouldn't. And when she's just, playing really elegantly, and when her dad calls her out, she just immediately starts playing chopsticks. And it's stuff like that, where you can see the character, like, starting to form, and how the character is starting to get comfortable with doing a facade and getting away with lying and stuff like that, which is so interesting because when we talk about Susie being the one that's sort of more versed in, lying and deceit and stuff like that, that she's the one that ultimately confesses first and kind of gets caught first, but not before, Sharon nearly completely blows the cover when she finally starts to crack and she goes on like a full tirade. But thankfully, it's a tirade that is so incoherent to somebody not in the know that the dad's not even putting the pieces together. And there is a similar scene like that. I do love in the remake when she starts going off in French, to the confusion of everyone around her. But it does feel like with Mills there might be a bit more of because as far as like the finite details of it, where we look into like how one of them has to fake an accent, and so the way to play this is to play a character with an accent and then play somebody that's faking an accent that's kind of not quite there. And I feel like Mills really sort of nailed that, where you can like actually hear where she's like poorly hiding an accent. And it's like you can tell they're doing that with Lone, but for the most part, it does feel like she does the switching accents perfectly well, at least as far as my knowledge of accents goes, which isn't much. But it's like I like seeing sort of the subtle struggle that you can see with that in Mills' performance, and it's the kind of thing where it's like, with Lone especially being a brand new actress, it's like when the accent is wavering, it's like, is it the character or is it their actress? But it's like you can really get the sense that it's clearly a character move, and if she did slip up, she could very easily get away with it. So there was that sort of safety net. And like I was saying, though, I do feel like we see much more of the arc of Sharon sort of almost like starting to become Susie as far as being able to do the things that she does. Like the moment when where it's clear that she catches on quick enough that we get the scene where she starts telling Vicky stories about their dad to make him look bad. And it's stuff like that where you can see that it's sort of, you start off as one character and then you can like just easily go into it, but then also the back and forth. Because another thing to point out about the original movie is that one of its 2 Oscar nominations was in editing. Because obviously, it's by 1998, having them both on screen at the same time looks pretty seamless. And with 61, I feel like it was, I don't know how many examples there will be of having the effects having done something like this by now, but there's still other clever ways they kind of disguise that. Like with the new movie when they're fencing, so they're both wearing, the masks or whatever, is really clever. And then there's the moment in the original movie where everybody's gotten into a food fight, and both of them look up, and one of them kind of has their face covered in cake. So it's like just finding ways around the editing also to make sure it sounds, because obviously there's going to often be times in both movies where there's a clear double that's like completely facing away from the camera, sometimes unnaturally, but for the most part I think both movies really pull that off well as far as making you believe that there's 2 characters here, to the point that even no matter how aware of Haley Mills and Lindsay Lohan you are, and the fact that there's only one each of them, when you get drawn into these movies enough, it does kind of, even though you can kind of see the tricks there, it's still kind of, you kind of just stop thinking about the fact that there's like trickery going on and that there's only one actress, because all four of these characters do ultimately feel so real by the end of everything. So there's that. As far as, I guess, as far as Lowen and these two characters being different, there is, there are some things here that are interesting as far as how these characters develop, particularly at the camp to start off with, like the fact that Hallie, I think, is the one that kind of is the slightly more out of control one, and she's the one that like suddenly has an entourage, even though it's both their first times at the camp. But just like it seems like one minute, Hallie's new, and then the next minute she has like these girls that just completely follow her around. There's the one girl that's just carrying her at one point. And I don't know that we got like a whole lot of that, but I suppose it does enough to sort of set up the character. Because there is a lot of movie here and a lot of story here to cover, because both of these movies are nearly 2 hours and 10 minutes, which is pretty long for a Disney comedy. But it does manage to do stuff with that time that more or less makes it warranted. It never feels too much like it drags on a bit. I do think the pacing of the remake is much better. The remake feels a lot shorter than it actually is, where the original movie does have some kind of meandering moments in the middle that do make it feel like they're not completely utilizing that time, but the remake feels like it kind of flies by, and I think a lot of that also has to do with the style of comedy is something that seems to change between movies, even though not much else does. Where we get like what's actually really interesting and kind of ironic about this is that despite the fact that the original movie is nearly 40 years older, if I'm doing my math right, um, but it's the remake that seems like it has a more old-fashioned sense of comedy, which is a good thing, because when you look at the original movie, there's a lot of like slapstick going on, where it's like somebody's gonna fall in a pool, and there's that awkward moment where Maureen O'Hara like punches the dad, and she says like stand back and puts her fist up awkwardly and stuff like that. It's that kind of stuff. Whereas the comedy in the remake is more like, seems more inspired by something from like the 30s and 40s, like almost like Marx Brothers like the scene at the hotel, the brilliant scene at the hotel where everybody's running around and everything's kind of coming together, but they're still kind of keeping secrets, and you're not sure who's going to run into who and who knows what and all that. And I don't think we ever get a scene that's that clever in the original movie, when you just kind of see all the pieces moving around. And like I said, I think it's that style of comedy that really has this great sort of energy to it and flow to it, that it doesn't feel its length or as long as the original, despite the fact that they're pretty much the same length. And it's because that's essentially what it is. I guess as far as slapstick goes, you do have the sort of prank war that's going on at the camp in both movies. And and what's interesting about that also is when you look at like a Disney comedy, is this prank war that goes on really could have easily probably been its own movie. It certainly would have been a worse one, but it still probably could have been its own movie, and they could have dragged it out enough. Um, I did never quite understand the skinny dipping prank in the remake, where it was like you have the scene in the original movie where they have the big dance, and it's boys and girls, and then she like cuts the back off of her dress, and because she's there and she's like on a date and all that, and there's boys and girls around, it's this sort of humiliating prank that kind of pushes her to go the extra mile, ultimately leading to a prank so big it's the one that ultimately brings them together. That, yeah, the skinny dipping prank has always been really weird to me, because she didn't seem that put off by being naked in front of all of them. She like turned around and saluted everything and just seemed kind of confident. So it makes less sense that the punchline of the prank is that they take her clothes and run off. So it's like, oh no, so if there's no humiliation factor here, it's, oh no, I've got to walk a few feet up the pier and back to the cabins. And they were, if I remember correctly, they were nice enough to leave her shoes behind, which would have been her, biggest hurdle here probably. So, that's always just been kind of a weird scene to me, but that's, but okay, it was apparently cause for a gigantic revenge, ultimately leading to what we have here now in this meeting where they come together. And this is another place where I feel like I appreciate the remake more, but if you'll bear with me, I'm still not entirely sure why. I know the point of these videos is to explain why I feel about these movies the way I do, but I don't know what it is exactly, because like I said, the scenes are pretty much exactly the same. And like I said, maybe, and it's really hard to say, maybe I lean more towards Haley Mills' performance than Lowen's, but if I do, it's just a very, very, very tiny bit. But yet, despite that, somehow, I find the heartwarming scenes in the remake significantly more heartwarming than the original, and I can't quite pinpoint why that is exactly. Because there's the moment where they kind of discover, what's going on between the two of them. And when they discover this, it's almost like whenever I watch the remake, there's like some kind of almost emotional feeling going on. And so, I mean, watching them figure it out and then realize that they're sisters and basically start loving each other on the spot like sisters. And the same scene happens in this one. And it's particularly touching to see, like the way she reacts to seeing her mom's picture, and then the way that contrasts or compares to when she actually sees her in person, and it's this really big thing, and that's great. But I never really feel like I'm on the verge of being emotional when I watch the original movie, but yet somehow there's at least a couple of scenes in the remake that kind of get me there, or almost get me there. And I'm really not sure what one is doing in that sense that the other isn't, because there's another really great scene. This one does make more sense because they changed it a little more. But that's when Chessie in the remake realizes what's going on, and she figures out that the one that she thinks is here is not that one. I think she's under the impression that it's Hallie when it's actually Annie, and her kind of coming to that discovery, and the fact, and I think it's also the fact of the way things are revealed in this and the way people react show that everybody on both sides of the family knows what went down. Like, everybody in the family knows that the other one exists and what her name is and just everything about that whole situation. Which helps a lot also as far as the emotion factor of it, sort of. Because this could have easily been dragged. Like, if nobody else knew, this movie would be at least half an hour longer while everybody tried to put the pieces together, but it's like, when it's just like, oh, she's acting a little differently. Is this like a changeling situation? Because this could be a horror movie. But the fact that she knows the other one exists and can kind of put together, like, God knows how, but somehow this has happened. And then the way they immediately turn it into an emotional moment is really great. Whereas in the original movie, it just kind of feels almost sort of unceremonious, the way she's ultimately found out by the grandfather and then just kind of has to say it. And it's like there's not really much of an emotion factor in it, at least that I feel. So it's like all of that is somehow apparent in this one, much more so. So as far as like side characters, like some of the ones we've talked about, I think that's another place that the remake actually improves also, because we do have, side characters in this. Like, Joanna Barnes is really good as Vicky, and then ultimately returns also as a character named Vicky in this one. But there's also the whole story going on with the grandmother and the grandfather, where the grandmother's like really overbearing and the grandfather kind of gets walked all over, and then there's the supposed to be big scene where he kind of stands up to her. And that scene seems like it happens pretty early, where he kind of finally stands his ground, and then it kind of feels like the grandparents are just pushed out of the movie entirely after that. I feel like we barely ever see them after that, or even hear about them after that. So it's like the movie just kind of abandons that and leaves it behind after it arcs. Whereas here we have a whole bunch of different characters. Like just right away, as soon as she gets to the camp, seeing the relationship between Annie and Martin is really nice, and then setting that up to make Martin a consistent character throughout the story, and then he and Chessie's whole thing. The whole Martin and Chessie thing feels like it should feel really tacked on and unnecessary or whatever. But I don't know. I think both characters are just so charming, and these are such charming performances, and like the chemistry's kind of there, despite the fact that they don't have a lot of screen time together. That I don't mind that. I feel like that's just another charm of the movie, just having these side characters having their own thing going on. Um, and I feel like that's a strength in this one that the original doesn't have. Also, Elaine Hendricks is very good as well, and I also really like the idea of having her character connect to the Natasha Richardson character in that way, where it's like she needs a wedding dress, and that's what her character does. And when they like meet at the bar, that's another thing that kind of has that classic comedy vibe, where they meet at the bar and they're like, they might as well be adversaries, but the two of them don't know who the other is. And it's like that. That's kind of stuff that the original probably could have done something with if it was in there. But yeah. Going on the parents now. I do think this is another. We're really leaning in one direction here. There is another thing that just really makes the remake, I feel like, stand up a lot more. And something that's very, very important to this movie that I feel like they put a lot more effort into in the remake. And there's also something here that just kind of can't be avoided, and that is the relationship between the parents. Because when I watch the original movie, when I talk about how it kind of feels like it meanders a little bit in the middle, whereas the remake has really good pacing, a big difference between these two movies is the chemistry between the parents, and I feel like that really affects the quality of the entire movie as it goes on, because once we get to the central point of the movie here, the parents kind of become the center of it for a while, with the twins just kind of in the background hoping this falls into place. That's another thing, too, that I feel like Nancy Meyers does really nicely visually here, where it's like, you have this moment that feels like a really classic, just sort of classic movie moment, where you have the two of them looking through the windows while they have dinner and kind of observing. Whereas in the original, it's just like, oh, they're just listening at the top of the stairs. And it's like the fact that Nancy Meyers kind of went the extra mile to do, like, something visual with it, which it happens throughout also. But what I was talking about with the chemistry of the parents is that there's definitely something between Dennis Quaid and Natasha Richardson here where, like, as soon as they're on screen together, like, even when they're not necessarily together, like, just that first moment where Quaid's in the elevator and he's like, it's like he's not quite sure he's seeing what he's seeing, and that, but then when they actually do have scenes together, there's just feels like there's immediately something there, and there's a charm between them, and you get the sense that there was something very romantic going on here, even if briefly, that they have a very, romantic and story path together, regardless of how, brief it seemed back then. And you very much believe that these are two people that could convincingly get back together, because you can actually feel that it's still in there. It doesn't feel like a contrived script pushing them together. It feels like these are two people that still have unfinished business with each other. I don't really get much of any chemistry. I feel like the scenes that are just the parents in the original movie feel like the movie just hits the brakes, and it's just like, okay, let's kind of let's get to the camping stuff, where, like, more interesting things will happen, and we get to see more, like, character dynamic between them and the fiance. But but I just don't really, like I was saying, where you have stuff like where they get slapsticky, where she puts her fists up in a weird way and stuff like that, and is trying to be like. What's especially weird about this is that Marina O'Hara, in so many other movies, she was like the queen of chemistry. She could have chemistry with, like, anybody, and I don't know. I just don't feel anything between these, and Quaid and Richardson, like, really feel like real people. They don't feel like characters that are, like, in the middle of some slapstick comedy that the script is pushing together. Where it just feels like, different sides of the spectrum, like night and day, complete opposites. When you look at the chemistry in one and then the other. And I think that's also especially comes into play with how they add a little bit more, because typically I'd be like, you know, you don't really need to add a final scene when your movie's coming to a close. But there was just something about that final scene that they added to the remake, because they set it up, is the important thing. Where it's the moment when, they're down in the wine cellar and he's talking about how, he should have gone after her. He didn't realize that she wanted him to go after her. This movie abandons, oh, it's a Disney movie about kids that are pulling pranks or whatever. It becomes a straight up romance movie that's really working. When he talks about, I didn't know you wanted me to go after you, and I didn't realize that could have changed everything. And so the fact that they set that up so that we can have the final scene where it's like the scene where she like shakes her head and leaves is like actually heartbreaking. Like in another movie, I would be saying, "Why aren't we wrapping this up? We're like reaching the 2 hour mark. What are you dragging out?" But when she leaves, it's this feeling of you really want them to get back together, and then when you realize what's going on here, oh, he has to right the wrong. He has to go after her. And then it's like when it all comes together, it's just kind of a perfect ending. And like I said, the way they're able to balance, being a movie about the twins, but also being about them—that's the magic of what's going on in this story. And like I said, the chemistry between the parents just really feels non-existent in this one. And you might say something like, when I'm talking about how much I really love the remake over the original, you might think, oh, is it nostalgia talking? Because a lot of people my age grew up with the remake and know it front to back. But I didn't. I remember when it came out. I saw bits and pieces of it for a while before I finally. It was a number of years after it came out that I saw like the whole thing from beginning to end. Um, but I didn't, grow up with it. And if anything, you would think there'd be a nostalgia factor for the original, because just like the way it's made, like when they go to the park and like the park's like completely green screen, but it just kind of has like this very old fashioned Disney feel to it. Like that's something that sparks a bit of a nostalgic feel. But no, it's not some sort of I grew up on this movie sort of thing is why I would favor it. It's just there's a lot of ways in which it really stepped up the quality, I feel like. And like even though it feels like the exact same movie and has a lot of the exact same scenes and dialogue, there's just these little tweaks that Nancy Myers and Charles Schreier did, that feel like I also love the detail that both their names, or when it says a film buy or whoever, that it's the both of them, and that it feels like this sort of thing, and the fact that the kids are named after their kids. It does feel like this very personal thing, despite being a remake. But that's and like little tiny details have changed here and there, like the picture of Ricky Nelson in this one is now DiCaprio, and it's stuff like that. But for the most part, I mean, they're both pretty much the same movie. But like I said, sometimes just little tiny changes can really work. And like I said, and getting actors that actually have chemistry, and being able to successfully make a romance movie, within this, a romance movie that could appeal to all the demographics you're going for. Where like I can imagine kids in 1961 getting bored in the middle of this. I did hear a story once where like Lucille Ball's kids, I guess, were obsessed with this when it first came out, the original movie, to the point that they were like desperate for her to get back with Desi Arnaz, I'm assuming. And that so yeah, I guess it had some impact on the kids of like 1961, but I can't imagine them taking to like I feel like there's a reason that you see it's not just oh a remake seems to have topped its original, but there's people nowadays that are just really attached to this movie still, that did grow up with it and stuff like that. But that's pretty much how I laid on these. I think I don't know if there was anything else that I was going to mention. I don't think so. So I guess we can leave this at that. I think it's clear that I do prefer one over the other. And it's yeah, like even when it's being self-referential, like even when Disney is referencing itself, like when they say that Elaine Hendricks is, they start calling her Cruella, and it's like not only is it just like, oh yeah, that's, you know, an apt reference, but the fact that Hendrix's performance does feel like a classic sort of Disney villain, a live action Disney villain at the very least. Like I said, while Joanna Barnes is, you know, doing great stuff here, there's just like everything about the remake, I feel like is just what kind of really sticks. Like I said, it may be, when I say maybe I prefer Haley Mills over Lowen, it's really just maybe I see just a little bit more of like the really specific details and the differences in the two performances that she's going on, and then I just love Haley Mills in general. She was like one of the best child actresses maybe ever. Um, but obviously, what Lowen is just, you know, completely 100% charming in her own right also, and doing, you know, just as well, doing the back and forth performances and stuff like that. And like I said, especially on her first movie, need as much emphasis on that as possible. So but that's, I think, how I feel about these. So yeah, I do kind of significantly prefer the remake, but you know, the original is still really nice and, you know, has its moments. But yeah, it's weird how you can look at movies that are essentially the exact same movie, but have like really different feelings about them. Like I said, whether it be how it works being two different things, how it works just being heartwarming in general and taking you to this, you know, emotional place of sorts. It's There's a lot that it pulls off, and like just kind of takes the extra step. So I think that's what puts us here. So the next thing is going to be completely different tonally. And we're going to the 70s versus the early 2000s, I think, or mid 2000s, for a completely different genre than this, with another William Hurt video in between, and another review video is going to be in here somewhere with like the Woman King and whatever the hell else has been coming out. So until whatever the next thing is, I think that's it.